start going around the table and letting each one introduce themselves. And
okay, I'm Carol. I'm Carol Dilly. And Roger, I'm a member of WADA.
Jenny Johnson, Swain County Center for the Arts.
Beth Johnson. I'm not sure who I am right now.
Well,
Thank you.
Maybe we can clear that up by the end of the.
Maybe you can help me.
I think that's third on the agenda.
That's first.
Bless your heart. Lisa Leffler, I'm at WCU and a native of Jackson County.
David Kozo, I'm over at the Extension Office in Cherokee, and I run the revitalization of traditional Cherokee artisan resources.
Brian Burke, I'm with the University of Georgia and the Coweta Listening Project.
Roger Clapp, Director of the Watershed Association of the Tennessee River.
and I'm Connie Southern. I guess you could say I'm sort of semi-retired, but an all-out volunteer and a weather buff. And I was telling them earlier, I've been a spotter for WLOS since the mid-'80s, and I'm the only original spotter left in Western North Carolina, and one of the few that has been through the National Weather Service training and everything. And I'm working on a book based on stories from family and neighbors and residents, and it's entitled How Mountain Folks Forecast Weather Before Doppler Radar. And I was encouraged by fellow colleagues and when I was working and everything, because I would say things about the weather and all, and they'd say, you need to be putting that in the book. Nobody knows that, and it's going to be lost with you. So that's why, and Roger asked me if I'd sort of lead the discussion, and I am a native of Swain County, and weather has drastically changed since I was a child.
Have you started writing the book?
Yes, ma'am.
Good.
It'll be out in the next month or so.
Yeah, I keep hearing about how they've had 3 feet of snow every winter and all that stuff. Yeah.
And 30, 31, there was a 2 feet of snow on the 4th of July.
Oh my goodness, I didn't
Wow.
know that.
Well,
Interesting.
So that's in the
Of course, I wasn't around then.
And I'm Avram Friedman. I'm the executive director of the Canary Coalition.
Of who?
The Canary Coalition.
Who are they?
The Canary Coalition is a grassroots organization that works for clean air, and we work on climate change.
Oh, in Swain?
Jackson County. Well,
area.
Our office is in Jackson County, but we have members throughout Western North Carolina.
And I'm proud to say that Swain County has some of the cleanest air and cleanest water.
We do?
We sure do.
I keep hearing about how it comes across from Tennessee and we're all going to get gassed. That's not true. I hope not.
This is my county, and as I told my science teacher when I was in high school, he took the class to Oak Ridge, Tennessee on a field trip, and the silos and the smoke coming out, and I said, you see that smoke coming out? I said, there's no way that all the radioactivity is gone. And I said, we're downwind of that. And he said, before it causes any damage in your county, in Swain County, we'll long be gone. I said, you may be, but that's my county, and I hope to live there and everything. And we have one of the highest cancer rates anywhere. And I saw an educational program, it's been about 15, maybe 20 years ago, and it was actually produced in Texas. Never really shown here, but it was produced in Texas. And it stated that this area, because it was downwind of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, had one of the highest cancer rates in the country.
Do they still have it?
It's not as bad as it was. And I'll explain why I think the air currents have been dispersed, and I'll explain why I think they have as we go along.
Interesting.
Does that include Graham County too?
Can I say a word?
Go ahead, Roger's
Okay,
there.
sure. The reason for this meeting started last fall when I went to an ad hoc group for climate change that Beth put together along with Dave. And there were a number of people who were working on various issues around climate and natural resources around here. So I guess there was a sense of getting together. and doing that. And that's when I met you, Brian. And I slowly but surely are coming to understand, I think, what the listening project is about, but I still want to learn more. But the idea of talking between citizens and between scientists, I thought was just a great idea, just fundamentally a good idea. And climate change is such a pressing issue. What a great idea to have it around climate change. So with that in mind, for a while I said, oh no, I can't do this sort of thing. And then I met Connie. Well, I'd known Connie for years. And I mentioned something about weather. Well, I got an earful. And I appreciated it very much. And I said, yes, there are people here who have a history of knowing how weather conditions have been here. And it's fascinating. Well, it is fascinating. It remains fascinating. But maybe at 3:15 on a Monday afternoon is not as quite as fascinating as I thought. We have a good many people who are interested in this. I find everything that I do with water is an experimentation, and this is one of those. But I'm so happy to do this and start this up now. Really appreciate, and Connie has really worked hard to contact 25 people, and there is a lot of interest here. It seems that I need to get on, what is it? It's a scheduling thing where you choose your meeting time. Doodle, yeah. But I think a lot of the older citizens here.
You probably got on Doggle.
For those of you who don't know, Doodle is a scheduling thing where everybody kind of decides on what time they can meet.
I have to tell you, it's almost impossible to get people in this town
It
out
is.
doing anything.
Yeah.
It's not your fault. I mean, it's a miracle you've got this many people.
Yeah. Well, the miracle shall continue for the next 45 minutes. But I'm delighted that you're here, and we'll have a good conversation. And later on, we'll go to Jackson County. We'll also discuss for half the evening this, but for the second half of the evening, we've got a scientist up from something called the Coweta Hydrologic Laboratory, and there'll be a short talk on what do the data say, and then there'll be a talk by Brian that's more how is the ecology responding to changes, or what changes are happening in the ecology. It can probably only be explained by weather differences or something like that. So it's a chance to talk back and forth, and I encourage everybody to come at 6:30 at the Jackson County Public Library. And so welcome, and Connie?
Well, we were going to have locals telling stories of weather when they were growing up, and my conversation with them, they'd say, you know, and I'd say, yes, but I need you there. Of course, and like I say, we have a lot of people that grew up here, 40s, 50s, 60s. You would not believe it, but they're still in the workforce, even though it's seasonal and everything. And maybe this time of day, you know, might be, but I even had reservation, a couple of people from the reservation that I talked with and everything that grew, their childhood was here and all. So I could tell you stories for half a day from my childhood. But one that really stands out in my mind occurred in 1950, 51. And at one point in the history of my family, my great-grandparents owned over 300 acres on the head of Brush Creek, and they belonged to the top of the mountain where it went over into Coweta. And my grandparents owned over 300 acres on the head of Mar Creek. In other words, they joined up at the top and everything. And that mountain went across over into Alarka. And I've heard my mom, my dad, aunts and uncles talk about times that there would be snowstorms, and it was very rare in the winter that there were not big snowstorms. and they would be 3 feet and over. They said that there would be drifts that were higher than a 6+ foot man that would be walking and everything. And I can remember the snowstorms when I was a child. I can remember when we got the electricity in our home and everything. We lived out on Brush Creek. But we were the first house as you go up Brush Creek, and Brush Creek Road came around like this, and it was sort of curving. Our house sat in the curve, and the yard was sort of a bank because the road was sort of sloped, but it was level where the driveway came into our home. And the neighborhood boys congregated at our home on weekends on Sunday. My dad was a big pal of theirs. I mean, he just sort of was, I guess, the guardian that kept them out of trouble or whatever. And it was farm. We grew practically everything that provided us food and all. And Dad would always grow a big crop of popcorn. We'd always have a field of popcorn. And I don't know if any of you remember, but there used to be these big tin barrels that they used for flour and meal. And there was an extra one in our home that Dad filled with popcorn. And so those boys would come like in the winter and the fall and the summertime. They were out helping their parents with their fields and everything. But on Sunday afternoon, they'd congregate at our house. Dad'd always have a puzzle. They'd work on puzzles. Mom would pop popcorn and have hot cocoa. So the boys, their parents knew they wasn't out into any trouble anywhere. They were at our house. Well, we had a big snow. And how those boys got to our house that Sunday, I don't know. Because that snow was every bit 2.5 feet. Well, they decided they were going to build me a snowman. So they started up here where it was level. And the snow was so high, and back then, snow would pack. You could get you a roll started, and you could actually roll it, and your snowman, your different sections like the bottom and the center and the head and everything, you could just roll it and then just turn it up and then stack it up. Well, it got to where that snowball for the base was higher than them. And all I could see, it was like the pistons in a car, you could just see their heads bouncing up and down. Because it was actually a ravine they were creating. That's how deep the snow was. And it got momentum. Evidently there was enough slant in our yard. It got momentum. And that snowball was rolling away from them. And it went off into the bank, off of the bank of our yard. But those boys were so determined that I was going to have a snowman that they all got down there and they rolled that ball of snow back up that bank into our yard. And that was the prettiest snowman I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen one like that again. But that's just one of the many stories that I know, and that I've heard family tell about the snow and everything. The flood of 1940, the river was here in town, and it affected that more than it did out in the rural community and everything. But the local people knew how to take care of the land. I remember after my great-grandparents died, and that land is still in the family. But where my grandparents lived, after he died, my grandmother maintained the taxes on it for years. And she would let men go in and cut timber, and she would get what was called stumpage off of it. But she would either have one of her sons or my dad to go in there, and they would mark the trees that the man that was going to be cutting could cut. And they didn't cut new timber, they cut aged timber that was losing its life and everything. And if that man cut a tree he wasn't supposed to, my grandmother would not let him back on that land again. Now that's how the locals were about maintaining. They knew that was their livelihood, and they protected that land and everything. And I will say the 50s is when tourism, and I will say the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park probably helped with that we started having them to come, and by the 60s, they liked this beautiful land.
Didn't the NOC start back then?
Huh?
The NOC, I think that started.
No, it was more like the late 60s, something like that, when maybe early 70s when it started.
73.
Yeah.
72 they started.
Wildwater was on there before NOC. Wildwater had rafting before NOC. Wildwater was the first company that had any kind of rafting on the river. And I can remember there's caves out there on the railroad track. And I can remember when people actually lived in those caves, especially in the summertime. There was an Indian family that lived in those caves, and there were very few homes out through there and everything, because it was wilderness. But you see, development, progress, I think what has occurred in our surrounding counties is what has affected our climate some, and as we go on and everything, we'll discuss that. We had sort of not like the jungle rainforest, but here in the mountains, we had sort of a natural, green, rainforest-like climate when I was a child. The greens now, and we've got all the different shades of greens and everything, but the greens now aren't, in my opinion, and I've talked to family members and everything, and they agree with me, it's not the greens. There's a dullness to them now, even though this year they've been very lush and everything. It is not the hue of greens that I can remember as I was a child growing up and everything. And like that, I don't know if Oak Ridge has got something to do with it. I used to have family that would come from out west, because I have family all over the United States, and they would talk about when they hit the Great Smoky Mountains and started to cross, the haze, the color of them, it's that bluish haze and everything. And they would refer to the industry that was east of the Mississippi till you got to about Knoxville, that created that haze. Well, that created smog. But that natural haze of those mountains, of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, is not smog. It was there when I was a child. There is over 1,000 different species of plant life in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and it's all different different chemical makeup of that plant life is what gives that unique color to the Smoky Mountains. I don't know if any of you are aware of that or not, but
I thought it was the mist coming up from the valleys.
no, that's that chemicals, the chemicals that plant life gives off, creates that now. That could be affected now, but I'm just talking about when I was a child, because one of my science teachers was my biology teacher. He worked in the park in the summertime, and he knew his facts, and we learned a lot about the park in our biology class and what it meant to this county. And see, with it a little bit over half the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is in Swain County. Something like about half of Fontana Lake is in Swain County. And now the tract that Nantahala, later Duke, that the Nature Conservancy owns on the Little Tennessee River, there's something like less than 7% of Swain County that's actually a tax base, because you've got your nonprofits such as your schools, your churches, and city governments and everything. And that creates a hardship as far as the tax base is concerned and everything. But it is a very great protection for us that live here and for what we've got. That you look at Swain County, at Jackson County, Macon County, the other surrounding counties, and how development, what it's done to the mountainsides and everything, and all the changes. But we've got a safeguard here in Swain County. And at one point, and I drew this that I thought I would show you. At one point, if you looked at our mountains here, and this is like when I was growing up as a child and everything, our mountains were a fortress. They were a fortress. And I used to think as Cleman's Dome, it's 6,643 feet above sea level. And then you go over here to Mount Mitchell, it's 6,684 feet above sea level. And then you got Mount Pisgah that's sort of out there to the south, that it's 5,449, and you've got all these other mountain peaks that are over 5,000 feet high. So it was a fortress, and whatever weather hit those mountains, it was a fortress, and that weather had to be strong enough to make it over the mountains. And if it made it over the mountains, the eastern slopes, that's where it dumped. You had to live on the eastern, and I've had people that live maybe a different side of the mountain than me, and they'd say, you get more rain, and I'd say, it's because of the side of the mountain I live on. You live not on that side that you get all that rain and everything. But then, in the 70s, is when I first started seeing the changes in our weather. When I was in school here in the 50s and 60s, we'd be doing good if we got 4 days of school in each year, in January, and even into February. But then in the 70s, it started changing. And our biggest snows, our snows that really put the snow on the ground, a pure snow, they would come out of their guff and they'd work their way up around Chattanooga, Tennessee, and come up and they would hit this side of the mountain. Now, the Tennessee side didn't get that much of the snow, but our biggest snows always came out of the guff and they'd work up from the southwest going to the northeast. And these mountains were a fortress, and that's how it had to work around the foothills of them. But then, in the 70s, we had Highway 74. Now, Fontana Gorge is still a buffer for us. Swain County is not as affected as the other counties is, because I firmly believe it's because that we've still got Nantahala Gorge out there, and we've not got the 4 lanes cut in Swain County like it did. But you had 74 that came through sort of on the foothills of these. But the big thing was you got Interstate 40, and look at the gorge that it cut in the mountains of Haywood County. And then over near Asheville, you got I-26, and it cut a big gorge up through Madison County. And I was talking a while ago about our air flows and everything. I believe that when those routes were cut in these mountains, it broke down our solid fortress that we had of weather as we had it in the past and when I was growing up and everything. And that's when I started seeing our weather and our climate changing. It affected temperatures, it affected precipitation, it affected wind flow and everything. In the early 70s is the first time we ever had a report of a tornado in this area. And that was after these 4-lane highways started being built. And now it's very common for us to, any time a serious storm is coming, that we're under a tornado watch, tornado warning, and everything. But that's what I was talking about, construction and development. And I think that's the big thing as far as our climate and weather. And people ask me, what is the difference in climate and weather? Do you all know what the difference in climate and weather are? Your climate is the typical temperature and weather conditions of the region. Weather is the state of the atmosphere with respect to cold, heat, rainfall, drought, and storms. But they go hand in hand. If your climate is not conducive to your weather, and that's like I said, we had like a natural rainforest here for years and years and years as I was growing up. But then, like I said, people started visiting, and they liked this, and they started wanting their homes here. And our mountains, if you think of it, if you ever watched your mother bake a cake, and she had the flour mixture where she would put it in alternate with the milk and whatever, and she would take that spoon, and she would take out from the base of it, what happened? It slid down. And I think this is what affected Peaks Creek in Macon County several years ago, that people had developed and constructed at the bottom of that mountain. And even though that slide was way up there, it was just sort of like that pile of flour that your mother would use for a cake. As they were constructing down here at the base of it, it eventually just caused the rest of that mountain above it to slide down. And that's why I said here in Swain County, we're sort of protected. We do not have that much land that can be privately developed and everything in construction. It has its good avenues and it's bad, but still yet our mountains have been sort of cut and everything, which has changed all our airflow. And how many of you ever thought of air conditioning? Most people think that air conditioning produces cold, that it makes cold. It does not. Air conditioning, refrigeration is actually drawing the heat out. So that's all in our atmosphere. And that gives us a greenhouse effect, I think. And I know in the 50s, 60s, we had a fan sitting in our living room window, a little fan. It kept our home cool and all. And I don't have air conditioning in my house right now. We have ceiling fans. We have an attic fan that we pull the heat out, and our house is well insulated, and so we're surviving. And it may continue to, at some point to survive. We may have to put air conditioning in, but until it does, I don't want anything to do with it because I know what it's doing to the environment. But the schools weren't air conditioned. Just think of everything. Your automobile. Of course, I know you can't go down the road, but my husband and I are constantly putting our windows down instead of running the air conditioning because we like. But in the summertime, when it gets so humid, and our humidity is worse than it used to be, and I think all of this, like we're talking, weather and everything, has affected that. Now, what are your ideas? I mean, we're all here to discuss. Has anybody else got any ideas or comments or maybe stories that you know of weather here in our past? Or?
Question.
Uh-huh.
You've been saying a lot that there's a lot more snow, it was a lot cooler. Has there been any stretches of heat like we've had lately?
No.
Anything you can
No.
remember like that?
Our summers would be hot, especially the first part of July till about mid-August. When we started back to school here in August, and it was usually between the 20th and the 25th, something like that, of August, we'd start back to school. You'd wear a sweater. And by September, you were wearing a light jacket to school. But the heat, and I don't know if anybody else has any knowledge of this, but it's been a couple of years ago that I saw scientists on television. This news commentator was interviewing him, and he made a comment that scientists were observing that with the orbit of the Earth around the sun, that the Earth was very gradually getting closer to the sun, and that was affecting heat on Earth. Now, I've never heard any other comments other than that one time about that, so I don't know if there's any data anywhere in reference to that, but I think that plantation, when you're doing development, if you look at developers, and like I said, we don't have that many in our county, we don't have the room, but they go in and they just mow down the trees, the vegetation, everything, and start selling lots for house seats. People go in there, what do? They'll have a well. A lot of them has to put their own well in, septic tank, and there'll be air conditioning sticking there. And I just think that what has occurred because of development is what's causing is an effect on our heat. It's just, everything is just modernization. There's a price for it. And
if you compare last summer to this summer, last summer, I mean, it was horrible.
It was miserable.
Really hot. This summer's been lovely.
This summer was more like the summers of the 50s and 60s here that I have seen since the mid-70s.
So what, I mean, obviously people are still building, I mean, nothing's changed other than the weather. So how do you account for that?
Okay. One of the things I learned in science, the stars and the planets, everything the way it lines up, and you've got your airflow, the currents, your jet streams, and all of that. And they talk about El Nino and all of that, and all. And I just think it was maybe stuff that took place. That snowstorm that took place on the 4th of July, there was a volcano, and I can't remember right now where, there was a volcano erupted, and it put a cloud of ash all the way around the earth that caused the temperatures to drop and everything. And so we've had some volcanoes erupting. We also had the nuclear thing in Japan. I don't know if the air currents from that but I've not heard a scientist say anything exactly what has affected, or even a meteorologist. I'm in emails all the time with Jason Boyer and Jay Siltzer and Julie, and we talk about it, and even Mike Bedditz at the Weather Channel, because Mike was in Asheville at one point, and I was a weather spotter when he was there, and we're all, I mean, there's...
Yeah, I mean, I just find it fascinating that everything seems to have become extreme.
And things sort of follow a cycle. I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, you've got everything burning up in the west, you've got
Mhm.
everything being washed away here, and why is...
And you got
what's
the
happened-
fires
What's
that-
happened to the middle of the road? It seems to have vanished.
I think we've destroyed, see, here in western North Carolina, we have got some of the oldest mountains in the world. We have got some of the most rarest rock formations. We've got more minerals, gemstones, specimens of that than probably anywhere else. I had a group from the North Carolina Mineral Museum in here one time that I worked with, that I hosted, and we took them out to the quarry out in the gorge, and they had backpacks, and they got off and they was going in their own little direction and everything, and we had our lunch and we ate our lunch and everything. About 2 hours later, here they started coming back out of the different little ravines of the mountain out there and everything, and I thought of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They had rocks. Their backpacks was as packed, as full as they could of specimens that they said they couldn't find anywhere else, that they found here. So, things, and there again, you get in, like out west, you have the large cities where you have all the air conditioning, all the gases and everything that are man-made and produced. And that has a big effect on your climate and weather. So and just like in the Northeast right now, they were supposed to be down below freezing this weekend. But
Really?
then it's gonna. And used to that jet stream sort of flowed, and it's like I said, you take I-40. I-40 goes all the way west, and look at the other mountains and areas, and you've got other 4-lane highways. If you take a map of the United States, just look at how many 4-lane highways go this direction, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, or whatever. And our country has totally been chopped up to, we don't have the topography.
But if it's flat to begin with, it probably doesn't make much difference, right?
Yeah,
It's-
probably not in Nebraska.
Yeah, somewhere out like that.
In terms of the extremes, I don't know about the projections for elsewhere, but in this area, that's one of the things that they expect for the future climate, is not so much less with temperature, I think, but with precipitation.
Mhm.
They expect much drier dry periods and wetter wet periods. So the thought is that in the next 20 to 80 years, there will be much more extreme weather here. Now, the fire in Yosemite, I think, is probably, well,
It was that.
it's somewhat different. I think it's like the fire in Yellowstone in the 80s, where it was decades and decades of not allowing fires.
Mhm.
So all the kindling built up, or at least that's part of it. But
Yeah, we've got, you look around, and when we have a storm or the wind, you can drive through our county, and there's dead timber that should have been cut out, but they're not allowed to.
But the
I
Smoky
mean,
Mountain Park, I think, doesn't it insist on a wilderness thing, where they
Mhm.
leave it the way it is, and they don't allow that kind of thing to be clear?
But you see, there again, our moisture basis is different than it is out west. We've got a more moist climate. They've got a drier climate out there. And if you talk to, and just to give you proof of that, if you talk to a doctor that deals with sinuses, nasal, stuff like that, they will tell you this area right here is the worst area in the country for anybody that has such issues. That if they could live out New Mexico, out in there, those countries, of those states where it's a lot drier, that they don't have those issues out there.
And I concur with you, Connie, growing up in Jackson County. I remember very vividly the 60s as a child. being able to tunnel through and make igloos and
Mhm.
tunnels in the snow in the wintertime, making 6-foot snowmen. I had a picture that I kept for years of one of the snowmen that was close to 6 feet. And I remember my dad had been to Texas and he had had a Stetson hat. So I thought, boy, that hat would look really good on that snowman. So I put it up there, and of course, went in the house and forgot about it. And there was no more Stetson hat. And then I couldn't sit down for a week after that. But, we had snow. We had a lot of
We
snow
had
in the
snow, and it was a
wintertime.
different texture snow.
And the ground was frozen.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when people died in the wintertime, sometimes you couldn't bury
You could
them.
until spring.
And so you had to wait until spring, fall. And then that's when you could, bury folks and do other things. But
It's
we
when the
had
service fair is blue.
right, right. And there was, there was a lot of rain.
Mhm.
We had a good bit of rain. It seemed like it rained almost every evening in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And the river stayed high.
They did.
Here, with the wonderful rain that we've had this year, we've had the kind of rain like you were talking about back then, we had this year. But almost immediately, 2 or 3 days after that rain, the rivers go way back down again. Now, they didn't used to do that. And there's a huge difference with that. And my mom and my uncle, who spent a lot of time outdoors, just before they passed, they would make mention of how even animals had changed, their behavior had changed, how they could used to tell about preparing for winter or summer or other things, that they were not as consistent
They're not.
as a sign.
They're as confused as we are.
Yeah, they're as confused as we are. And when plants are blooming and budding when they're not supposed to, and things like that. So they were very acutely aware of how erratic, I guess, the weather seemed to be by watching everything.
Where did you grow up in Jackson?
We had a place up on, they called it Tip Top, behind the hospital, that mountain that sits behind the hospital. We were the last house on top of the mountain. And we had orchards and, a subsistence kind of, we didn't have really a farm, but we grew everything we ate and all that sort of thing, like most people did back then.
How would you approach it? I just know the roads around the hospital and
Allen's Branch,
Allen's Branch.
all the way to the top of Allen's Branch.
I'll have to look for that.
And now it's it's I don't know who owns it now, but my dad, we left when I was in junior high. He had a job out in Pitt County, North Carolina, and I thought I died and gone to hell. We left the lush mountains of North Carolina and ended up in the middle of a tobacco field in a trailer. And so I just thought I'd died. So, but I think my pediatrician had actually purchased the land and the house, and then I think it's been sold again since then. Somebody would have horses. I think we had a barn when we had horses, but it's changed quite a bit.
Were you kind of looking towards the Smokies to the west?
We were looking directly over the hospital.
So that would have been a little bit to the south and the west.
Yeah, and
South.
Meade Corporation was in full bore, and so you could wake up in the morning and you just see smog, that white, and you would see the ring of dead trees all the way around Meade that were brown, where the pollution had gotten them. But it was still the winters were winter and
Summer was summer.
summers were summer. Spring was spring and fall was fall.
Do you
There was a
remember some of the
distinction.
things that your mom and your uncle looked at as indications of how the seasons were going to change or what was going to come?
Well, they looked at squirrel tails and different kinds of worms and
The woolly worms.
yeah, and they were keenly observant of plant life too. They were also very observant of salamanders and, amphibians and that sort of thing, and could tell that there were great problems that we had here in the area.
And in the spring, the birds would come through going north, and there would be certain species of birds that you wouldn't see here except in the spring and the fall, and you pretty well can see them most of the year now and everything.
And why do you think that is?
Because the climate's changed. See, they would be going north where it was cooler in the spring, and then they'd be going south in the fall where it would be warmer. And this was sort of mediocre here, and so but this has got to be like it. I mean, there's no distinguishing element from north to south to in between now.
And you did see the temperature become much more moderate through the 70s and then in the 80s, of course. And now, I mean, why people will live here year-round now, because the winters are more moderate. It used to be people didn't want to be here in the wintertime because it was really winter.
The first frost, they would leave.
They're back to Florida.
Right.
And the ground would freeze every bit of 2 feet down. Homes that had running water, like a spring with a reservoir or whatever, those pipes would be buried at least 3 feet, sometimes 4 feet, but so that the water would not freeze because you knew. And that's what helped get rid of the bugs. We didn't have the issue with mosquitoes that we're having now.
With what?
With mosquitoes that we're having now. And the old-timers saying if you don't get cold enough to freeze that ground far enough out, we'll be plagued with bugs next year. And that was true.
Well, the fleas this year are wicked.
But yeah, that's what the ground has to be frozen for that snow to accumulate, and it frozen that deep. That's why we had I think that's part of the reason that the snow stayed there. We had our big snows, but the snow was definitely a different texture than it was now. I'd eat snow cream back then. I won't eat snow cream now.
So
There's
basically,
no way.
what you're saying is that you're not sure that it's climate change. You think it's
I think it's
changing.
man-made. I think it's man-made events that's caused the climate change because we've destroyed what was here then. As I said, progress has its price.
Yeah. Do we?
Nature itself is still there, and it was like it was.
What about if you go to countries or areas that really have not had this kind of change with roads going and stuff? I mean, are there such things that one can see if things have changed?
They're more like there's not been that big change in their climate.
Far north of Canada or something. Has everything changed up there? It has. I mean,
But they've had some development like us.
Have they?
Yes,
They're
they've
not
had some
building
development like
highways and
us.
stuff, are they? Cross-eyed.
I think it's pretty well documented that the climate has changed everywhere.
And things, like on a large scale, like I was talking about the size of the United States, you have an overflow because you've got the air currents and everything. And I think what could happen here to change our climate would have an effect. They talk about the ice around the North Pole and the Arctic and the Antarctic, how it's melted and everything. Well, look how they've destroyed the rainforest in the jungle. There was a purpose in the eco-environment of that. And I think that's one of the big issues that can affect around the world.
In terms of your question about sort of global climate change, I think, and what Connie's talking about too, like Abram said, it's really well documented that there are changes globally. But what I think is really interesting is that scientists are starting to look at, within that global change, smaller regional changes as well, like the ones that Connie's talking about. So one of the professors who works with us, who's the president of the American Meteorological Society, his research, he's looking at how, okay, we have all this global change, but do we see, in addition to that, regional changes? And he started talking about the ring of asphalt in this area, actually creating local level climate changes because of first a ring of asphalt in all the cities around here, and now the wheel and spokes of asphalt that he sees here. And he's saying really similar stuff to what you're talking about. You figured it out before he did.
Compared to, big scheme of life, we have very little asphalt.
Oh, compared to other places, but that's what's amazing is that what
we-
they're finding is that a small amount can actually make pretty big differences.
It draws
Yeah.
the heat. It
What about
it
if
draws
you did
from the
stone
sun.
instead of asphalt?
That's a good question. I don't know.
The natural formed rocks here do not absorb and draw the heat like asphalt does. And it can be 85 degrees here in Bryson, just to give you an example. It can be 85 degrees here in Bryson City. You can get in your vehicle and leave Bryson City at 85 degrees. And you get out on Brush Creek on 28. You've got 28, that's a 2-lane road that goes out through there that's asphalt. Brush Creek is asphalt. Sawmill Creek is asphalt, a part of it. But you get out there on Brush Creek and the temperature is going to be 79, 80 degrees.
And because the
There's at
roads are
least,
stone,
there's,
is that why?
because you've got the asphalt, everything here in town, you've got the 4-lane highway around Bryson City, and you may not think that, and really and truly when you think of New York City and Los Angeles or places, it may not be that much asphalt. But for our area, it is quite a bit of asphalt.
And the other piece of it, I think, and I don't know all the details about how it works, but part of it too is the way that all the roads and all the development changes water flows too. So water doesn't sit in the mountains as long and cool things as much, and the forest gets broken up into patches that don't have the same cooling effect. So it's not just, I mean, part of it is actually the asphalt absorbing heat, but part of it is all these other little changes that come from it.
A good example is when they built the 4-lane from Elam, up in Bryson. That road fell off how many times?
Well,
Had to be
it's right
repaired.
now an inch and a half. They're monitoring it again.
And the locals told the engineers from DOT
That's not
years
gonna work.
ago, can't do that, mountains are natural watersheds. And when you cut into them, that water's gotta go somewhere, and it's gonna undermine your highway.
Which highway is being undermined? 74?
Yeah.
Just before the High Creek exit.
It's been repaired
On the
multiple
far
That
side.
dip, no, it's the one coming toward Bryson. It's the dip. If you're coming from Silva,
Oh, that big dip?
Yeah, it's falling.
So it's towards Silver or the other? Or towards Bryson?
it's toward it's on the lane going west, coming toward Bryson.
If you're on 19, but you choose not to go across the bridge and stay on 19, but travel up towards High Creek, right?
You said it was 74.
It's on the
It's
4-lane.
a
That's
4-lane. It's a 4-lane.
Four-lane, right.
Yeah, I
But it's
almost
right
never
over
go
that
west.
access river
I
road.
use that exit, but I almost never go west from there. I
But-
go on 19.
But all through every county, there are those roads
Those
that have to be
issues.
constantly repaired because they're breaking into the mountains where, that are the natural watersheds. And the water will go somewhere.
My-
Undermine those roads.
My husband's uncle was an engineer for the construction company that built 40 through Haywood County. Those engineers told DOT, you will always have an issue with rock slides if you cut through that gorge. They didn't listen. And it's been a constant thing ever
They
since.
wild rock side up, remember?
As a matter of fact, I was on my way I went to school at Knoxville, Tennessee, and I commuted. Anyway, I was at the Welcome Center at the restroom. And one day on my way to class, and I was walking to my car, and this older gentleman parked beside me, and we started talking, and he had been one of the engineers that built the road through the gorge there. And he was talking about how it was a miracle that they got that road finished. He said it was, they were told it could not be done. They were told but couldn't happen. But they finished it, and they did it. And I didn't ask him, but I wanted to say, did somebody not tell you about, how difficult it would be to keep the road there, and it not shift? But he was, of course, very proud of that accomplishment. He was retired and lived somewhere out west. And it is a pretty miraculous feat, for sure, to have cut that road through that gorge. But, nature will prevail in getting the water to where it wants to go. So it's amazing. People just don't listen. They'll build their houses on places that you think, why would anybody do that? And before long, here they come down the mountainside,
Yeah. People tell me it's always people from Florida. I don't know if that's true.
I think it's anybody that really doesn't know the nature of mountains. I mean, they don't have to be just from Florida.
They just pick a spot that they've got a beautiful vista, and that's where they want to put a house.
Yeah, they always say you should look at the older houses to know where to build. That is true.
The locals used to say that the state followed a black snake when they built 28 from here going to Franklin because of all the curves. You had engineers that had knowledge. They actually followed the contour of the mountain base, and you don't hear a slide up on what they call Allen Cliffs, where all those rocks, and they used some dynamite there, and I haven't heard of one there in several years, but that's the only issue on 28, and it's not near like it is on 40, but those people, they followed the contour of the mountains when they built 28, even though it is so crooked.
Connie, do you have stories either from yourself or from folks you've spoken to about floods and landslides and droughts as well?
When my grandmother, her last days, her restless time would be from evening about dinner time till just after midnight. And I was the one that would sit with her at night. She wanted her last days to be at home, so I came and stayed at my parents' house, and my husband would come when he could and everything. And an aunt came up from downstate. And there was one night that she was doing this. And she was saying, oh, Lord, what am I going to do with these little children? And, I'd try to talk to her, and I'd say, it's going to be okay, and all. And she finally settled down. But the next morning, I asked Mom and my aunt, I told them about what she was doing. And there was a creek that came down by their house. My mom was 2 years old when her dad died, and my grandmother was expecting their 11th child. And so they made their living on that mountain farm on the head of Brush Creek and everything. But there had been some storms, and I don't know if this was, I don't think it would had to be in the 30s when this occurred. And they said that branch got up level with the porch of that house, and that my grandmother was actually walking the porch, rubbing her hands like that, saying, oh Lord, what am I going to do? Help me with these children. And said she did not sleep a wink that night, that she stayed and kept a vigilance on that till she could, because even to take them to the barn or anything would not have been any better that she could, but that's one that I remember.
And do you have a sense if floods have become more common?
They're more frequent. I mean, 1940 was the flood that the river came out almost to the square and everything. And 73, we had some flooding, and I want to say 65 or 66, it was a hurricane came through here. But other than this past January, when we got the monsoon rains and everything, that's what started our rainfall for this year. We had 22.2 inches of rain in January here. Usually the only flooding would come when maybe there'd be a cloudburst in the summer, as they call it, a cloudburst in the summertime, or a hurricane. Just your normal rain, we didn't see any flooding. And now you can have, I mean, we were used to it raining for 2 or 3 days at a time. And everything. You couldn't put the clothes on the clothesline. You had a clothesline strung up in the kitchen or on the back porch or somewhere like that to trying to get the clothes dry. But still yet we didn't have the flooding. Like she said, topography hadn't been disturbed like it has now. And that river level, it might rise a little bit, but when the rain was over with, it didn't go down like it does now. It might go down a little bit, but
I have the emergency that kept me late getting here means that I have to leave early right now. I think this conversation is great. I want it to follow its natural course. I'll be there at 6 o'clock for our 6:30 meeting over in Jackson, but I do have to leave. And I really appreciate you being here and doing this. And talk on. I've got my own climate story, but it's 400 miles away. Just that the rivers were froze up so often that I would buy ice skates, and now not a kid around would investigate ice skates one bit, and that's in the Maryland suburbs of Washington. Anyway, I have to go. Thank you, and appreciate it, and we'll see you later. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks.
okay, is there any other comments? Anybody else got anything you want to share or comment on?
Well, you know, I come from down the hill, you know, from eastern, North and South Carolina, and I always thought the mountains were where it snowed all the time, you know, and, you know, as I was growing up, you know, we'd have 2 inches of snow, and it would be very, very exciting, you know, started coming up here in the 70s, going up to Penland School of Crafts in the summer, and coming in late August and needing a sweater, and and that wasn't that long ago, you know. I'm not that old. I guess I am. But anyway, I finally moved up here in 1980, and I remember asking, do I need to get snow tires? You know, things like that. And I lived on this house, and there was a pond below it, and it had a cold snap, and the pond froze, and that was really exciting. And I actually walked on it because I was so excited to see the frozen pond. And fortunately, didn't go through it. But I asked somebody that lives there. I said, you know, does that pond still freeze? No, it's never frozen. You know. So you know,
you got lucky.
The last one. And then my daughter was born in '87, and she didn't see snow till she was almost 3, and we were in Charleston. You know, there were just a couple winters with no snow at all wherever I was living. You know. We went to Charleston, and they had a freak snowstorm around Christmas and stuff. So, you know, like I said, I haven't been here that long, but it's been enough to see some changes. And of course, the extremes in temperature really, you know, got worse, because during my first 10 years here, there was a couple summers where we had some drought, you know, but now it's just, you know, all or nothing. So it is very, very different here.
You're talking about the springs being redirected. A few years ago, when Duke was putting all these towers through here, there's one behind our house. Our house goes right up against the woods back of it. Our backyard is right against some woods, and we have a pet panther, so. But they had to blast a little bit up there, and our spring is up there. And I really believe the Indians built our spring. It was on the property when my mom and dad bought it, and it's our spring. But my husband calls it Fontana Lake. because it just goes back in the mountainside like this, and there's big slabs of rock on the walls of it and everything. So I really believe the Indians or somebody that had some knowledge of that did that spring. But when they did that little bit of blasting up there, it rerouted our water from the source, underground source, to that spring. And we actually had to drill a well. So, and an engineer said, well, if you could be patient, it wasn't the fact that you needed water. He said it will eventually trickle back, and it'll find its original route underground. And it took it about a year and a half, but it did. So we now have a spring and a well, but it's back just exactly, just as full. And especially with all the rain we've got now. Last year it was back, but especially with all the rain we've got this year, there's a little branch that goes from our spring down the side of our property that for the overflow. So we went, when they put the well in, we said we want to leave our spring because I love the spring water. So I've got an aunt that I carry spring water to in Haywood County, but they put a little switch on our water line in the basement. So all we have to do is just go turn one off and turn the other one on, and so we can get the spring, and if the spring gets low, we can go back to the well. Because it had something like 100 gallons per minute, the well did. So there's a good underground stream where we live. Okay, anyone else got anything you want to share, or any questions? I appreciate your time.
Actually, I have
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Brad.
What do you think, so you said, you think development has caused most of these problems, or lots of them. What do you think can be done to solve them or to stop them from getting worse?
The devil me word, zoning.
Yeah.
What's that?
Zoning. The devil me
Yeah.
word, zoning.
But you know that.
But that's the
everybody's
death, that's the
allergic
death
to
of
that.
any politician that mentions that. But to me, that's the first step. And with zoning, they think that zoning is to this, all the way to the end. But there are different degrees of zoning. And I feel like we could have some zoning that could have some regulations that when they start developing and breaking down or surveying off their lots and everything, that there could be some regulations about how much vegetation can be disturbed, how many trees can be cut. I mean, you can go in and build a house and you don't have to mow every tree down. We built our house, and I think we cut 3 trees. And like I said, we don't have air conditioning. We got Mother Nature's trees all around us and everything, and with that big attic fan to pull it out, and our ceiling fans, and the house being as insulated as it is, and our windows have got that solar thermal film between the glass and everything. So we stay very comfortable. We stay very comfortable.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I've been talking with a fella in Australia, actually. He does research out there with people who are in mining communities in Australia. And he came up with a term called solastalgia. And basically it means that people who have seen drastic changes in their landscape end up with depression and things like that. And I know that that was something that happened to my mother. She was very, very distressed by all of the changes that had been occurring in the mountains in Jackson County and other counties as well. And I know that there are folks who had their farms cut through with 26 up in Madison County, who saw a lot of devastation of their farms. Have you witnessed very much of that going on with older folks who see that kind of thing? I know that the development's not the same.
Right. The development's not the same in this county, but my in-laws lived in Macon County. And when they built 64, they cut their property in half. And their home was on one side of the 4-lane, and the spring was on the other side. And my father-in-law held out. There is a pipe, that will be there till something totally destroys 64, that the water line runs from the spring, and we still have my husband's home place, even after his mother died and everything. And but my father-in-law, that was one of his things he held out for, and he even got legal advice until he didn't want his spring disturbed. And we still use that spring, and that line comes under that, and if we was to ever have to replace it, we just dig down to it, and we get there to the 4-lane, there's that big pipe and everything. And he also, they made a new driveway for them. You used to have to come off of the old 64, but they made a new driveway for him. And there's, right in that area, there's 4 other driveways, but he is the only one that's got a deeded driveway. He made the state those 2 issues because they would, it literally cut through the center of their property. And I think if more people, would stand their ground, but they just sort of just let stuff and everything, and children, the developer will come in and offer them so much money, and they think, oh, this is great, I won't have to worry about the taxes or the property or anything anymore. And but there's nothing that's regulating that developer and everything. But my father-in-law, he didn't live, he had developed cancer, and he didn't live that long after the 4-lane was open through there and everything. But I saw depression in my mother-in-law of what was no longer there. Sure did. We both did. We talked about it and all. So I think, yeah, you're older people. I really do. The people that would be in their 80s now. And I've seen some of that. Like I said, not necessarily here in Swain County, but.
Something happened to me last, January or February, I can't remember what it was, but something was blooming that wasn't supposed to, And I remember it was just like the rug was pulled out from under me. I was like, it was February, I don't know, maybe it said it was blooming in January.
Oh, the
Like
crocuses and
yeah,
daffodils came out so early. Last year was worse than this year.
Like that, and it was like, this is wrong,
Yeah, spring's coming too early. And it had the birds so confused.
Yeah.
I watched the birds, and it really had them confused. So yes, nature is as confused as we are. And there's more, and I know this is part development in any way. We could hear panthers screaming back on the mountains when I was growing up and everything, but we never saw one. I saw one right in downtown Bryson City.
A panther?
A panther.
Really?
Back in the early 2000s. I worked at Moody Funeral Home, and I went across to the other side to check something one morning, and the parking lot is behind the funeral home, and the IGA store is right. And I saw this big black thing standing up on the wall at IGA, and all of a sudden it leaped off of that wall, and it was coming at an angle across that parking lot. And I thought, whose cat is that? That is the biggest cat I've ever seen. It had that big old tail that curled down. But what throwed me off, it had a white collar. But it came across that parking lot, and there was a gap between the chain link fence and the back of the building. It went down between that gap, and there's a branch there. And the branch comes from the Catholic Church. It crosses Main Street. There's a culvert all the way from up behind the Catholic Church across Main Street, and it goes under Moody Funeral Home, back to where it's open there behind the funeral home, what was Moody Funeral Home. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that cat got in that and went up, or if it went down in the river. But I was talking to a wildlife officer about that, and he said, you saw one that had a tracking collar.
Had a what?
Tracking collar. I said, you all know they're in here. He said, see, and it's something that they'll deny if you publicly ask them. If you ask a Park Service person, and they'll say, get a picture of it. I even had one to tell me one time if I saw a track to lay a yardstick down and get a picture of it. But I was coming out from our home one morning on the secondary road, and we live parallel to the 4-lane. And I saw this big brown thing standing edge of my neighbor's driveway, and I started slowing down. I kept watching it, and I kept watching it. It was taller than my car. Standing, it was taller than my car. And it was a mountain lion. And it was brown, it had that big old tail, and it actually snarled at me. It just turned its head and snarled at me. And I just stopped, and it went right across the road, down into the branch, and I don't know if it went before.
I know somebody who saw a panther in Western Carolina, those apartments, the back of the apartments.
And then my husband, it's been about
Daylight.
3 years, yeah, it's been about 3 years ago. It was in the first part of June. My husband was mowing, and our driveway goes up and divides our yard a little bit. And he was on one side of the driveway mowing, and he looked up, and this black cat came across the other part of our front yard and was standing in our driveway, and they were eyeball to eyeball, and it was a panther. And I guess it was because the lawnmower was running, but it went on down our driveway and across the road. But they're in here, and we got clobbered by a deer on Father's Day. We was turning to go 28 out at Lueda, and there was one right there where that cemetery is. Came off and right into the side of the van, my side of it. It shattered. I had glass and deer hair all over me. The deer actually brushed my shoulder as that glass came in. So they're getting more, and we've seen them on our road. We've never seen them before. And their habitat is being disturbed with all this development. And all. Used to be you'd get out in the woods and walk and you'd see them, but it's not like that anymore.
My aunt, I was talking to my aunt yesterday. She lives in Nations Creek, and she said that, she can remember when her husband and the guys would go coon hunting, and they'd have to drive 30 miles. Of course, you don't have to drive 30 miles anymore because they come out, from all over the place. So their habitat is being invaded, and they don't know what to do, where to go.
Or they come to Brazil.
You'd be surprised.
Well, I know they're out there. But
Yeah.
not as many as there used to be.
Yeah.
Anything else? Well,
Yeah,
I
thanks.
do appreciate your time, and I hope you appreciate you sharing. And I don't know if you learned something from what I said or not. I'm just an amateur, but I document. You ought to see my office where my computer is and everything, and the discs before I've been trying to put stuff on the computer and then putting it on CDs to keep and everything. Going through that box of stuff that my mom kept.
Well, I do have to sort of keep tuning in or every now and again. Let us know what's happening.
Okay. If you got email, you want to give me your email address? I've got a piece of paper here.
Are you going to make your book available at the City Lights in Selma?
Probably. I've got to go talk with them. I think Drake and Franklin, they have